Mexico's sweeping overhaul of the country's court system took effect last month in the final weeks before President López Obrador handed the keys of the National Palace to his mentee and successor, President Claudia Sheinbaum. Mexico is now one of the few countries in the world that elects its judges, including at the Supreme Court level, by popular vote rather than by appointment. This widely controversial move has led to protests by the federal judiciary as well as criticism by the United States, Mexico's top trading partner. What exactly does the overhaul entail and what's next? Back on the podcast to discuss are Javier Martín Reyes, a researcher and professor at UNAM, the large university in Mexico City, Universidad Nacional, Autónoma de México, and David Gantz, the Baker Institute Will Clayton Fellow on Trade and International Economics. I'm Tony Payan, director of the Center for the U.S. and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas. And this is Mexico Centered. Javier, thank you for joining us. Tell me, what is this judicial reform in Mexico about? What's going on? What are the major pieces and components of it? And what does it do to the country's judicial branch?
Thank you very much, Tony, for having us. I would say that this reform is complex, but in general terms, I would say there are three main pieces. The first one is provisions that basically want to dismiss all sitting federal and state judges. This has never happened in Mexico, especially during the democratic era. But what will basically happen is that between 2025, next year, and 2027, all judicial seats will be open for an election. This is pretty problematic because many of these judges have lifetime appointments. In the case of Supreme Court justices, their limits are 15 years, and these appointments are not going to be respected. The second component, it's a pretty clear intention, objective to capture the judiciary. We will have judicial elections that are going to be controlled by the government. The nomination will depend on President Sheinbaum or both houses of Congress that are dominated by Morena and their allies, and only a third of the candidates could be proposed by the Supreme Court. So I would say this second component will generate a judicial branch that will be conformed by people who are close to the government and Morena. And the third part of the reform are several provisions that want to weaken the judiciary. So the powers of the federal judicial branch will be diminished, especially in amparo lawsuits, which are pretty regular and common kind of lawsuits in Mexico that are intended to limit the federal legislative and executive branches. So in a nutshell, Tony, I would say that this reform seeks these three objectives.
And for the audience, the amparo means essentially an injunction, a stoppage of some legislative initiative or an executive order that protects either the individual or the collective that particular action affects, right?
Yes, absolutely. It's a way to challenge both laws and governmental actions that are contrary to the Constitution or to fundamental rights.
David, what do you think?
I obviously agree with my colleague who's a real expert on this. I'm just looking at it from outside. I have several problems. First of all, I think there will be chaos mid-year 2025 when you have essentially hundreds of candidates running for, 750 different audiences. I don't know how the electorate can easily distinguish between better candidates and worse candidates. In Arizona, our judges have to be approved after 4 or 7 years. You vote, keep them or get rid of them. Hardly anybody ever gets turned down, even for tax evasion or something like that, because the electorate simply can't handle dealing with several dozen judges on a ballot. In Mexico, you're talking about a much bigger order of magnitude. The second problem I have is I worry about competence. There's a corruption problem in the judiciary, some parts of the judiciary now, but I worry that when all of the candidates, or almost all of them, presumably, are Morena connected, I wonder, particularly in some local areas, how many of those are Morena candidates that have been vetted by the drug lords. And I think this is a problem. The other problem, as others have mentioned, is Mexico has a totally unregulated lawyer system. You have, 1,000 or more law schools, that every one of which has been approved by the Ministry of Education. Some of them only have a few students. I'm not criticizing the better law schools. There's some really fine law schools in Mexico. But essentially, there's no control over anybody setting up a law school that he or she wants to. There's no bar exam in Mexico. So once you get your licenciado, you can go and you can practice law. And there's no character and fitness exam. So, in a worst case scenario, a member of the cartel can go to a law school, get a certificate, and he or she is a lawyer, and some 4 or 5 year experience, she or he is a judge. The idea that a judiciary could be rebuilt that way, first of all, in a few years, and secondly, when there's no oversight of the legal profession, seems frightening. Now, maybe there will be a corruption problem, but there's going to be a competence problem that's just as serious if you're a foreign investor looking to be able to challenge actions. Amparo is cut way back in terms of its scope. And most are aware there's an effort to get rid of all the independent administrative agencies, whether they deal with power issues or antitrust or anything like that. So basically, it's going to be a bunch of Morena judges sitting in judgment over something Morena presidency does. And I don't see that that is going to be a very good situation.
So, Javier, clearly there's a motivation for this. Let's go a little deeper. What is moving the Morena party that currently governs Mexico in its coalition with the Green Party and the Workers' Party, and previously President López Obrador, and today President Sheinbaum, who's not stopping this, who's not exercising her own leadership to say this is madness, this is taking us down the wrong path? What is the real motivation of politicizing and restricting, co-opting politically the judicial branch? I mean, this is a little bit of an insane road that they're going on, don't you think?
Absolutely. But I would say that the objective is pretty clear. They want to get rid of the checks and balances in Mexico. López Obrador was a very powerful president, but he was also a president that was limited by the courts. So, for example, when he wanted to pass an energy bill that was against the free market in the energy sector, there were decisions by the court that say the Constitution does not allow you to do that. When López Obrador wanted to militarize the National Guards, the Defense Department could control the federal police, the court said that there was a constitutional provision that didn't allow him to do that. When López Obrador wanted to reform the electoral system in Mexico, there was also a decision by the Supreme Court that limited those decisions. So I guess that President López Obrador learned over his period of time that courts are a check and a balance on the executive power. And of course, the solution is a complete disaster. We don't really know how these judicial elections are gonna be implemented in 2025 and 2027. I totally agree in terms that there's a huge risk in terms of ending up with not only a partisan judiciary, but a quite honestly incompetent judiciary. That's a extremely high price, but I think Morena, President López Obrador, and at least at this point, President Claudia Sheinbaum are willing to pay that price because they want to control the judicial branch. And of course, that raises a lot of questions in terms of if Mexico could be still considered a democracy if you don't have an independent judiciary.
So, David, if you're a foreign investor and you're looking at a new judicial branch that is co-opted, whether by organized crime or by the political party, because not just anyone can run. For what I understand, the new judges are going to have to be handpicked, some by the Senate, some by the president. So the nominations are themselves controlled into a bottleneck. It's not like you can just pick up and run yourself. You know, there's going to be a bottleneck, a certain process in which they certainly are going to be able to pick the candidates. If you were a foreign investor, what do you do with this absence of checks and balances and a professional technical judiciary that can decide on the fairness, the merits of the case, what your investment should be or end up?
I don't think most observers think the current judiciary in Mexico is wonderful, but in many respects it works pretty well, and investors have learned to deal with it, particularly the Supreme Court and particularly the amparo review of government acts, the latter of which becomes much more limited. As I've thought before, I don't think it's just the issue of you have a single party system with no real checks and balances. I mean, you've had that in China, you've had it in Vietnam for years, but it's become very predictable. And there are ways people get around it. And in places like Vietnam, you have international arbitration available for major disputes. Under USMCA, the availability of third-party arbitration is greatly circumscribed, since it's still good in a few sectors like electricity and telecommunications and petroleum, but in most other areas it's very, very difficult to get to international arbitration. And I think if you thought that the July 2026 elections would go smoothly, and say by August or September you have a pretty good idea, at least half the judiciaries, some investors may say, okay, we can deal with this. I think the investors that are best able to deal with it are Chinese investors, because they're used to having all of the problems you have in Mexico.
And perhaps even pay off.
They're used to corruption. They're used to one-party government. They're used to lack of a rule of law. And many of them have learned to work around that. And a huge influx of Chinese foreign investment into Mexico is probably not in the interest of the United States, even if U.S. and other Western investment volumes go down. So that's one of the peripheral concerns, I think. As I say, if investors see predictability in a new system in a year or two or three, many of them will go back to investing in Mexico because they figure they'll be able to work around some of the problems. But I think there's a period of at least a year and perhaps several years when many investors, maybe even some of the Chinese, will sit on their hands because they just don't know what the future is going to bring. For example, Sheinbaum, if she's smart, will try to encourage a lot of independent power production. That means you have an auto factory in Nuevo Leon, and next door you have a clean energy producer, and they supply the auto factory. You don't have to deal with CFE, which has a monopoly. But if you're going to do a power plant, you're talking about 10, 15, 20-year investment. Do you really want to take that kind of a risk with your money? I think the answer may well be no.
Now, Javier, if you look at the administration of justice, justice for regular Mexican citizens, the folks that want some grievance redressed in the judicial system, because this is also going in at the state level, right? Those changes are going to apply to the state level, and so the states will have to change their constitutions to adjust to the federal constitution and such. We know that the administration of justice is a whole chain. It begins with some sort of complaint, formal complaint, and then an investigation, and then the gathering of the evidence and the composition of a case by lawyers on both sides, and then the judicial process or the court part of the system that link that particular stage is just one of them. This doesn't fix any of that. I mean, like David said, it's already an imperfect system that is kind of broken at almost every single stage of the administration of justice. This is going to break the last component, which was more or less functional without necessarily increasing justice on a day-to-day basis, what we call daily justice.
Absolutely. I would say that's the paradox of this reform, right? I would absolutely agree that the Mexican judicial system is not perfect. In fact, I would say that only a few pieces of the system work relatively well. As David says, the Supreme Court works, the amparo jurisdiction works. But at the same time, we have to recognize that between 70 and 80% of all cases that are heard on the judicial system are decided at the local level. Local judiciaries are not far from being perfect. They are quite imperfect. They are not really independent. They do not get the budget that they need. They do not have the number of judges that they need to hear all those cases. This reform not only does not resolve those problems, but creates other problems in terms of, partisan capture and, getting people there who lack the most elemental knowledge and capability to perform the judicial office. And the other thing is also true. Most crimes, for example, in Mexico, do not end up with the person being convicted for those crimes. But if we want to fix the system, then we shouldn't focus only on the judicial branch. We should focus on polices in Mexico at the state, municipal, and federal levels. This reform does nothing to improve police in Mexico, and also prosecutors. In Mexico, we don't have a strong system for investigating crimes. And this reform also does not address those problems. So what we basically have is a very imperfect system that really works only on the last part, right? When you end up in the federal branch, in the Supreme Court. And this reform is kind of dismantling and it's weakening what works relatively well, and it's not solving all those issues that happen before a case reaches the federal jurisdiction.
I think a concern, David, is the fact that now you're going to have a National Guard, which is essentially the federal police, that's going to be under full command and control of the military. And then you're going to have a judiciary that's fairly co-opted by Morena, even if they're not nominally members of the party. They're not supposed to be. We know that they've actually nominated a lot of folks to positions when they were not supposed to be members of parties, and they still do it anyway. So nothing is going to stop them to nominate folks that are members of the party or been activists in the party to these important technical positions. So a federal judge is going to decide violation of human rights by the National Guard, which is under the military. I don't see the military looking at some federal judge and saying, oh, you were so right, we're so wrong, we're going to give some kind of compensation, there's going to be some folks punished, especially if the judges are not nominally, but certainly loyalists to the regime. This is going to be a system that's completely wrecked and completely unbalanced vis-a-vis these very powerful actors like the military in control of the National Guard.
Well, certainly nobody is going to challenge any of the kinds of human rights violations the military has committed in the past. And I think it's worth noting that the military powers have been vastly expanded by López Obrador. For example, they run the Customs Service now. I was talking recently with a customs broker in the U.S. who said basically they're incompetent and they're corrupt. Other than that, they're good. They run parts of the railroads. They have many, many other functions that you wouldn't normally think, including, of course, taking over the National Guard, but you wouldn't normally think would be under the wing of the military. I mean, if it were any other Latin American government, you would say, we're setting up a coup. Mexico, I don't think that's an issue. But the fact is, asking the courts to review actions of the military, for example, it seems to me is a total waste of time.
I have a political question, Javier, and you're looking at Sheinbaum, and there's only two hypotheses that I can think of as to why she's allowing this to happen in Congress. This kind of madness that we saw with this raffle drawing names and who's going to be thrown out of the judiciary first and who in 25 and then who in 27. Either she's in agreement with this that's going on, knowing full well that this is not going to work, in which case she's complicit, or she's not in control of Congress. And Augusto López in the House and Fernández Noroña in the Senate are really party ideologues who believe in this project, and they're in control of the legislative agenda, and they're not hearing Sheinbaum's potential concerns. And she's certainly not saying, hey, would you hold on? I'm the president now. I have a different agenda. I have a different idea. Or maybe she expects to intervene later in the enabling legislation. Either way, this is a political mess that's going on in Mexico, and it's a political mess designed to dismantle whatever little actually works in the federal government.
I guess both explanations could be partially true, right? I'm thinking about the judicial reform, right? For me, it is pretty clear that, as you said, there was an opportunity in the secondary laws, in the enabling legislation, to limit some of the most dangerous provisions of this reform. But that didn't happen. President Sheinbaum decided to present two bills that were approved in less than 2 weeks in Mexican Congress, and they basically maintain this reform, this possibility of, picking who is going to be on the ballot on a partisan basis was not really limited in the secondary laws. So I guess on the one hand, it could be true that she truly believes that these reforms are important. Let's remember that Claudia Sheinbaum is by no way a moderate. If you see her ideological perspective, her previous political career, she's coming from a very strong left-wing ideology. So it wouldn't surprise me that she really believes that judicial elections are the way to democratize justice. And at the same time, we should be very clear that López Obrador was extremely successful, not only in defining the topics of the election, not only defining the legislative agenda that has been implemented during the last weeks, he was also very successful in limiting Claudia Sheinbaum. Her most important political rivals are in Congress, as you say, and now in the party, in Morena, the son of López Obrador, Andrés López Beltrán, is going to hold a very relevant position. So she was a president that won with 60% of the vote. That's absolutely true. But at the same time, there's going to be a lot of checks and balances, not on the constitutional system, but inside the Morena coalition. So I would say, at least at this point, Claudia Sheinbaum has not been able to, take a different agenda from that one that was imposed by President López Obrador.
David, the U.S. is absent. Our diplomacy seems to be paralyzed. President Sheinbaum recently announced that Ambassador Ken Salazar will no longer have direct access to the National Palace or to any of the members of the cabinet. Sheinbaum has just announced if the U.S. ambassador wants to address himself to the Mexican government, he must do so through only the foreign minister. That sort of narrows the ability of the U.S. to carry the dialogue to other places. Are we asleep at the switch? Is our diplomacy failing to understand what really is going on in Mexico? Are we understanding that this takes Mexico further and further away from the United States, from the club of liberal democracies, well-run market economies?
All of the above, I think. The Biden-Harris administration are mostly focused on the Middle East, on Asia, particularly China and Taiwan, and on the Ukraine war, except in the few economic areas where both Harris and Trump are going to make it impossible for Mexico to export electric vehicles to the U.S., and Trump may make it impossible for them to export any vehicles. The other thing is, for Trump, for Biden, for Harris, immigration is at the top of the list, and everything else is way, way below immigration. The auto issue has come up in the last month or so, but before that, the Biden administration, I don't think, cared about anything Mexico was doing as long as AMLO was cooperating on immigration issues. They took the GMO corn problem and they gave it to a dispute settlement body a year and a half ago that hasn't done anything. They filed a case on expropriation issues that has been sitting there for 2.5 years, never pursued. So I think it's pretty clear that immigration is the focus. I think Harris will have to make it the focus if she's elected, and you know that Mr. Trump will do so, God knows using what kind of techniques. But if you go back, there are periods when the U.S. paid a lot of attention. First, George Bush negotiated NAFTA. Bill Clinton, in January of 1995, bailed out Mexico with a $25 billion loan. It's hard to think of any other real examples in the last 30 or even 40 years. The economic back and forth most of the time has worked pretty well through various legislation prior to NAFTA, then with NAFTA, and even now with the USMCA. But I won't say it's been hands-off. One term I have used in the past is to say not so beneficial lack of interest. It just has never given the importance of Mexico, our biggest source of imports into the U.S. Obviously a major source of immigration, both legal and immigration. You might think, as a few members of Congress, like Tony Gonzalez, have suggested, we'd be paying a little bit more attention. We pay more attention to Canada in many respects, maybe because it's closer to Washington, and maybe because the problems aren't nearly as significant. If your biggest problem with Canada is softwood lumber and milk, that's a really good situation. With Mexico, it's a lot more complicated, and as an observer of this for more than 50 years, it still astounds me that the governments in Washington are paying less attention. In some periods of time, we have the governors of the border states meeting and trying to do things once or twice a year.
They haven't met since 2010, I think, almost 15 years ago.
In Arizona, there's close relationships with Sonora, but that has nothing to do with the federal government, and it works out pretty well, and it's by governors of both parties have pursued it. I don't think there's anything like that between Texas and the border states here. So,
Javier, let's walk back a little bit to explore one other aspect of it. Here's 2025, 20 positions are up for election. That's about half of the judiciary, the federal judges in Mexico. The election is a fiasco. 10%, 12%, 15%, who knows how many people are going to show up. You're going to have a ballot with thousands and thousands of names, at least 3 names per position. It's going to be very confusing. We know that people in Mexico often vote for the political party, and then the electoral authorities sort of distribute the weight of the ballot among the political parties. It's a simpler type of system, but it's a fiasco. Is there legitimacy to this? If folks don't show up after an election in 24, it's going to be very hard to get people to look at ballots with thousands of names on them and then be able to reasonably choose who's more competent and who's not among all these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of names. The kind of research that is required, even for elections in Texas, where you often have 120 names on the ballot. You have to do so much research just to figure out who's who. Is this a legitimate system? Does it matter if it is a fiasco of an election and only a very small percentage of folks actually show up or even make mistakes that invalidate their votes? What comes next?
To be honest, I think judicial elections are in general a bad idea precisely because of that. There are 2 things that are always necessary in elections. The first one is political parties, right? You need these party IDs in order for people to have shortcuts, right? To know what they are voting for, even though...
It's a cognitive shortcut. I vote PAN, I vote PRI, I vote Morena, whatever.
Exactly, because I'm left-wing, because I'm right-wing, because I'm on the center. It's really almost impossible to ask, regular voters to do research on hundreds or thousands of candidates. And in Mexico, in these elections, political parties are not going to participate and they're not going to be party IDs on the ballot. And the other thing, which is absolute nonsense, is that the fact that both public and private finance is going to be forbidden. So basically, you will not be able to use money for campaigns. And again, if you want elections, then you need campaigns. And if you need campaigns, then you need money. The huge problem, from my perspective, is that there's going to be money in the elections. The thing is, it's not going to be legal money. It's going to be illegal. So that opens the possibility for organized crime and other kind of interest to try to, buy the judges. But in any case, my prediction is that turnout it's going to be very low. In Mexico, sometimes at midterm elections, turnout is around 40-45%. My expectation is that turnout is going to be extremely low, 10%, perhaps 20%. And that, of course, creates a problem in terms of how legitimate, how democratic these elections are going to be. And on the other hand, with very few votes, people are going to get elected. And again, it could be organized crime, it could be other kind of groups or interests could have a major say on those elections. Those things are predictable, but Morena, López Obrador, and Claudia Sheinbaum didn't want to change the proposal that was presented in February. So I guess in 2025 we will see the negative consequences of a design that it's nonsense in many ways, but also that has very perverse intentions on the other hand.
This is very concerning, David, because I think one of the reasons that Sheinbaum has said this, that they believe that it's better to elect federal judges is to prevent them from being corrupt. But if that were the case, then mayors and governors and many other elected officials would not be corrupt. If this were the antidote to corruption, to organized crime penetration, to injustice, then we'd have a stellar executive and legislative branch, and we do not. So all they may be doing is exposing yet another set of public officials to this kind of corruption.
I think that's quite true, and as my colleague has suggested, the risk of that happening in 25 and maybe again in 2027 seems to me very, very high. I have some limited experience with judicial elections in Arizona where the judges are appointed, but every 7 years they have to go through an approval process. you can have 30 or 40 lower court justices on the ballot. And most people are voting, leave those blank. They have no idea who these people are. I mean, there are documents available, but who's going to read them, particularly if it's an important election for other candidates? So I think it will be a shambles. The only hope is that by 2027, enough people will have figured out that this is an awful mess and Morena will lose its supermajorities in the congressional elections. However, if Sheinbaum, by some miracle, manages to deal with the crime and the drug and the organized crime problem, she'll probably get a big number again. And again, I'm guessing that unless there's a big issue on the ballot, there won't be a huge turnout. There certainly isn't in the U.S. when you have midterm congressional elections. So I've often thought that the only silver lining for Sheinbaum, if in fact she's not a true believer but is mostly a puppet, is that if she loses the majorities in 2027, she will have to tell Morena and Lopez Beltran and Lopez Obrador, look, I have to be able to negotiate with these other parties if we're going to get anything done at all, and we have these problems. I don't see much hope for her sexenio otherwise.
Javier, one more question. Where are Mexico's citizens? Obviously co-opted by a number of cash transfer programs that are designed to build loyalty to the political party. That's going to run out. I suspect that the money is not going to be there. Mr. López Obrador already burned through lots and lots of savings caches in the country. The national debt is growing. The budget deficit is certainly growing as well. I think the economy stalled, so the tax base is not going to expand. So that's going to hit a brick wall at some point. But citizens, when you ask them, or at least the polls that I see, they're still willing to give the government the benefit of the doubt. They're suffering from extortion and kidnapping and lack of public safety and security and stalling economy and deteriorating healthcare and educational system and on and on. But when you ask them, hey, how is the government? How is the party? Fine. We often place a lot of the burden on citizens to inform themselves and even in the United States, this is a problem because we only have so many hours a day. But where are the citizens in Mexico? Why can't they figure out how to rebalance power?
I would say, Tony, that in any democracy, you always have the problem that regular voters have a lot of issues in their day-to-day life. It's sometimes very difficult expect them to, invest a lot of time, money, and energy in knowing what's going on. But at the same time, I would say in the last elections, 40% of voters in the legislative elections didn't vote for Morena and their allies, right? It's almost half of the country. Of course, in Congress, Morena and the allies have almost 3/4, 73, 74% of the seats. But that was because both the electoral management body, the INE, and the election court decided that Morena could have those levels of over-representation. So I would say that part of the answer has to do with opposition parties. Mexican society is still plural. Mexican society has different viewpoints. We saw that during the 2024 elections. But the traditional parties in Mexico, the National Action Party, PAN, which is right-wing, and the PRI, the Revolutionary Institutional Party, which is more on the center, are clearly not doing the job. I think that their leaderships are not fit to face this situation. And I guess that Morena and their allies are really taking advantage of that space. And I think that citizens eventually will feel the consequences of bad policies. We don't know when, 2 years, 3 years, maybe 5 or 6, but that's going to happen. But they also need alternatives. And opposition parties in Mexico, I would say, are not doing the job that they should be doing in this critical juncture of Mexican history.
Yeah, and they don't have the numbers and the brands have fallen in disrepute. David, one last question for you too. We have elected judges in the United States at the local level, in Texas, for example. They're partisan. Here, though, they're supposed to be nonpartisan. So it's going to be very hard to attribute the incompetence of a judge to a particular political party brand because they're supposed to be nonpartisan elections. They work relatively okay. I don't know if in Arizona, where you sometimes reside, or in Maryland, where you also reside, that's the case. But in Texas, certainly we have them. We have elections. Even the Supreme Court, Texas Supreme Court, is elected. Can this really work?
I don't know that much about the Texas system other than they're all elected judges, and I suspect in most, certainly with the Supreme Court, with local judges, some of the mid-level judges, I would expect that in cities like Austin and Houston and those districts, they're probably very mixed between Democrats and Republicans. I would guess, I don't have any numbers, I would guess that overall, if you looked at the total number of judges in Texas, you would find that probably at least 3/4 of them identify as Republicans. Arizona has a very different system. In the large cities in Tucson and Phoenix, judicial candidates are suggested by an independent board, and the governor picks from those judges. And then in, 5 to 7 years, they have to stand for renewal or vetoing. They hardly ever get vetoed. And this goes to the Supreme Court members, which are nationwide, the district courts of appeal, Pima County and Tucson, Maricopa County around Phoenix, and the Superior Court judges all are selected this way. In all the other counties of Arizona, they're elected. The DC District Court of Appeal and the Superior Court judges, they have elections that are partisan. The judges try to raise money. If you're in a small city and you practice regularly before the courts, you're in a really serious conflict of interest because the judge is going to be asking you directly or indirectly for money. So I think the Arizona system for the large cities probably works pretty well. I think for the smaller cities, it's a little bit more of a problem. I don't know how it's done in Maryland because I don't vote there. I don't really understand.
But obviously the problem is that Mexico also has these additional layers of organized crime, corruption. So there's potentially other problems that you may not see in Arizona or even Texas. It's a little bit more complicated, I think. Well, it's been a really very good conversation, David. Thank you very much for joining us today. And Javier Martín Reyes, professor of law at the Universidad Nacional, Autónoma, México, the big university in Mexico City. And of course, David, my colleague here at the Baker Institute. Thank you both. For more on the challenges facing Mexico and the Claudia Sheinbaum administration, watch our October 15th event featuring Javier, David, Ethos Innovation and Public Policy Executive Director Liliana Alvarado, and Texas Congressman Tony Gonzalez, available at the link in the show notes. The Judy Lay Allen Mexico Center podcast is brought to you by the Baker Institute Center for the U.S. and Mexico, which seeks to have a meaningful impact on the U.S.-Mexico relationship through binational policy research and solutions by convening leaders who can bridge the world of ideas and the world of action. Special thanks to Judy Lay Allen for her generous support of the work that we do here at the center, and to Lisa Wakita, our program manager. This episode was produced by Lisa Wakita and Karina Siemel. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org/Mexico to learn more, and thank you for listening.